The briefing room at RAF Debden smelled of cigarette smoke, sweat, and worn leather. Captain James Rook Sullivan sat in the back row, his flight jacket unbuttoned, dark circles under his eyes betraying another sleepless night. Around him, 23 other pilots of the 334th Fighter Squadron shifted in their metal chairs as Major Richardson pointed at the map of Germany with his wooden stick. "Gentlemen, today's mission is critical," Richardson's voice cut through the murmurs. "We're escorting 36 B-17s to the Messerschmitt factory outside Regensburg. Intelligence reports heavy Luftwaffe presence. We're talking 60, maybe 70 German fighters. They know we're coming." Rook traced his finger along the armrest, his jaw tight. Regensburg, the name alone had cost them 8 pilots last month. He glanced at the photograph tucked inside his jacket pocket. His younger brother Danny, grinning in his army uniform before shipping out to Italy. Danny's last letter had arrived 3 weeks ago. "Nothing since, Sullivan." Richardson's voice snapped him back. "You'll lead Blue Flight. Keep those bombers alive." "Yes, sir," Rook replied, his voice flat. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, sitting beside him, leaned over. "You good, Rook? You've been somewhere else lately." "I'm fine," Rook said, standing as the briefing ended. But he wasn't fine. Every mission felt like borrowed time. Every escort run meant watching bombers explode into fireballs, while German 109s and 190s swarmed like hornets. The mathematics were brutal. For every bombing raid, they lost men. Good men, friends. Outside, the January cold bit through their uniforms as they walked toward their P-51 Mustangs, lined up on the frost-covered tarmac. Ground crews worked frantically, loading ammunition belts and checking engines. Rook's plane, tail number 413, wore the name Charlotte's Wing painted beside the cockpit, named after his mother, who'd died when he was 12. Captain Sullivan, a young mechanic, called out jogging over. Sergeant Pete Morrison had been maintaining Rook's plane for 6 months. "She's ready, sir. New engine tuning, all systems green." "Good work, Pete," Rook said, running his hand along the Mustang's sleek fuselage. The aircraft was beautiful. Elegant lines, powerful Merlin engine, deadly 650 caliber machine guns. But beauty meant nothing when diving through flak at 400 miles per hour. Webb climbed onto his wing nearby. "Remember that dive you pulled last week?" Command wasn't happy. "They said you exceeded structural limits," Rook remembered. During a dogfight over France, he'd pushed his Mustang into a near-vertical dive chasing a Focke-Wulf 190. The airframe had screamed, a rivet's groaning, but he'd caught the German and sent him spiraling into the countryside. Afterward, the engineering officer had lectured him for 20 minutes about stress fractures and manufacturer specifications. "The manual says, don't exceed 505 miles per hour in a dive," Rook said, checking his parachute straps. But that German wasn't reading the manual. "One day you'll push too far," Webb warned, but there was admiration in his voice. 30 minutes later, they were airborne. The formation of P-51s climbed through patchy clouds, their Merlin engines creating a symphony of power. Below, the English countryside spread out in winter browns and greens. Rook adjusted his oxygen mask, scanning the sky with practiced vigilance. At 24,000 feet, the air was thin and cold despite the cockpit heating. The bomber stream appeared ahead. 36 B-17 flying fortresses in tight combat boxes, their silver bodies catching the pale sunlight. Rook felt the familiar weight in his chest. Each bomber carried 10 men, 360 lives depending on the fighter escort to keep them alive long enough to drop their bombs and return home. "Blue Flight, this is Rook," he transmitted over the radio. "Spread out, maintain spacing. Keep your eyes moving." His wingmen, Webb, Lieutenant Carl Jensen, and Lieutenant Tommy Brennan, acknowledged. They'd flown together for 4 months, surviving missions that had killed better pilots. There was a rhythm to their flying, an unspoken understanding built on trust and close calls. The formation crossed into German airspace near the Dutch border. The landscape below transformed. Cities, forests, rivers, all enemy territory. Every mile deeper meant more danger, more chance of encountering Luftwaffe fighters or deadly flak batteries. All fighters. "This is Shepard Lead." The bomber commander's voice crackled through Rook's headset. "We're approaching the flak corridor. Stay sharp." Black puffs of anti-aircraft fire began exploding around the formation, like deadly flowers blooming. The Germans had perfected their flak techniques, time-fused shells that burst at bomber altitude, sending razor-sharp shrapnel through thin aluminum. Rook watched one B-17 shudder as fragments tore through its tail section. The bomber held formation, but smoke trailed from its damaged fuselage. "Bogies, 2 o'clock high." Jensen's urgent voice cut through the radio static. "Count 15, no, 20 contacts." Rook's eyes snapped to the indicated direction. There, German fighters diving from 30,000 feet, their distinctive silhouettes unmistakable. Messerschmitt 109s, the backbone of the Luftwaffe's fighter force. They came in a coordinated attack, diving through the bomber formation with cannons blazing. Blue flight engage. Rook pushed his throttle forward, pulling up to intercept. His Mustang surged with power, the G-forces pressing him into his seat. He selected the lead German fighter, watching it grow larger in his gun sight. At 400 yards, he pressed the trigger. 6 machine guns roared, tracers arcing across the sky. The 109 snap-rolled left, evading his fire. Rook followed, banking hard, his wings nearly vertical. The German was good. Tight turns, altitude changes, using every trick to shake pursuit. But Rook had logged 340 combat hours. He anticipated the moves, staying on the German's tail through 3 full turns. At 200 yards, he fired again. This time, bullets stitched across the 109's wing root. Smoke erupted, then flames. The German fighter rolled inverted and spiraled downward. Rook didn't watch it fall. There were more targets. The sky had become chaos. Fighters twisted and turned in deadly ballet. Bombers maintained formation despite losing aircraft. One B-17 exploded in mid-air. Another fell away with 2 engines burning. Parachutes blossomed like white flowers against the winter landscape below. Each one represented a life, hopefully captured rather than killed. "Rook, you've got 2 on your 6. Webb's warning came too late. Cannon shells cracked past Rook's canopy. He yanked the stick hard right, rolling his Mustang into a split-S maneuver, inverted, then pulling through into a dive. The pursuing 109s followed, their pilots determined. Rook's altimeter unwound rapidly. 22,000 feet, 20,000, 18,000. His airspeed climbed past 450 miles per hour. The Mustang vibrating with speed. The Germans stayed behind him, closing the distance. These weren't rookie pilots. They understood pursuit curves, deflection angles. Rook's mind raced through options. Standard evasive maneuvers weren't working. They anticipated every move 15,000 feet. Airspeed 490 miles per hour. The control stick felt heavy in his hands, the airplane straining against aerodynamic forces. The manual's warning echoed in his mind. Do not exceed 505 miles per hour in diving flight. Structural failure may occur. Behind him, the Germans closed to firing range. He could almost feel their gun sights settling on his aircraft. Then something clicked in Rook's mind, a crazy, desperate idea born from hundreds of hours in the cockpit and an intimate understanding of his aircraft. The P-51 had one advantage the German fighters didn't: dive speed. The Mustang's laminar flow wing design gave it exceptional performance in high-speed dives. But the manual limits were set conservatively by engineers who'd never faced 2 Germans trying to kill them. What if he went beyond those limits? 12,000 feet. Airspeed 510 miles per hour and climbing. The Mustang groaned, metal stressed beyond design specifications. Rook pushed the nose down further, ignoring every instinct screaming at him to pull out. The dive angle approached vertical 20 miles per hour. The airframe shrieked. Rivets vibrated. But the aircraft held together to miles per hour. The Germans behind him fell away. Their 109s couldn't match this speed without their own structural failures. Rook watched his pursuers break off, climbing back toward safer altitudes. But Rook kept diving. An idea was forming, dangerous and unprecedented. At this speed, with this dive angle, the energy was incredible. If he could transfer that downward velocity into horizontal speed and altitude, 8,000 feet. He began his pullout, gradually increasing back pressure on the stick. G-forces crushed him into his seat. 5 Gs, 6 Gs, 7. His vision narrowed, gray creeping in from the edges. Blood drained from his brain toward his feet. But he'd trained for this, knew how to tense his leg muscles and abdomen to fight the blackout. The Mustang's nose came up, up, up. The horizon appeared, then the sky. He was climbing now, trading that massive speed for altitude. 10,000 feet, 12,000, 15,000. His airspeed bled off, but remained higher than normal. He'd gained tremendous energy from that. Dive, and now he was behind the German formation, the 109s. that had been attacking the bombers suddenly found themselves in a deadly position. Rook selected the nearest target, a fighter just beginning its attack run on a damaged B-17. He fired a long burst from 300 yards. The German never saw him coming. The 109's cockpit disintegrated under the .50 caliber barrage. What the hell was that? Webb's voice came through the radio, shock evident. Rook, you just came out of nowhere. New trick, Rook replied, already searching for his next target. The German formation was confused, their coordinated attack disrupted by this Mustang, appearing impossibly behind them, with tremendous speed advantage. He used that advantage mercilessly. Another 109 crossed his path. Short burst hits on the engine. The German fighter belched black smoke and limped away. A Focke-Wulf 190 tried to engage him, but Rook had too much energy. He zoomed past the German, climbed, then came back down with superior positioning. The dogfight lasted another 8 minutes. When the German fighters finally disengaged and fled east toward their bases, 5 of their aircraft were falling in flames or trailing smoke. The bomber formation had lost 3 B-17s. Terrible, but it could have been much worse without the fighter escort. Blue flight, form up, Rook called, checking his fuel gauge. The hard maneuvering had burned through his reserves faster than planned. Let's get these bombers home. The flight back to England felt longer than the mission out. Rook kept replaying that dive in his mind. The screaming metal, the G-forces, the way his aircraft had responded beyond its supposed limits. He'd discovered something, though he wasn't sure exactly what yet. A technique, a tactical advantage, or just a good way to tear his plane apart. They crossed the English coast as the sun touched the western horizon. The bomber stream was scattered now, some aircraft struggling on damaged engines, others maintaining formation discipline. Of the 36 B-17s that had departed that morning, 33 were returning. Still losses, still men who wouldn't see tomorrow, but better odds than recent missions. Rook landed at Debden as twilight settled over the base. His hands trembled slightly as he shut down the engine, not from fear, but from adrenaline crash. He'd pushed harder today than ever before, and somehow, miraculously, his plane had survived. Pete Morrison was waiting as Rook climbed down. The mechanic's eyes widened as he examined the Mustang's airframe. "Captain, what did you do to her? These stress marks, you exceeded dive limits by a lot." "Had to," Rook said simply. 2 Germans on my tail. "The engineers are going to have words with you," Pete warned, but he was already making notes for the maintenance crew. The debriefing lasted an hour. Rook explained the dive, the speed, the pullout. Major Richardson listened with a mixture of concern and fascination. The intelligence officer recorded everything, particularly the tactical implications. "You're saying you went vertical at over 530 miles per hour?" Richardson asked. "And the aircraft survived?" "Yes, sir. And when I pulled out, I had enough energy to climb back into the fight behind the German formation. They never expected it." Webb added his observations. "I saw the whole thing from altitude. It was like watching a falcon stoop, straight down then up with incredible speed. The Germans scattered when Rook came through." Richardson drummed his fingers on the desk. "This could be significant. If we can replicate it, if we can teach it." He paused. "But the risks. We could lose pilots testing something beyond aircraft limits." "Sir, with respect," Rook said carefully, "we're losing pilots anyway. Last month we lost 12 men in this squadron alone. If this technique gives us an advantage, saves bombers, saves lives, isn't that worth exploring?" The major didn't answer immediately. Finally he nodded. "I'm forwarding this to Fighter Command. They'll want engineering analysis, test flights. In the meantime, Sullivan, you're grounded from combat missions until we understand what you did up there." "Grounded?" Rook's voice rose. "Sir, we have missions scheduled." "That's an order, Captain. We can't risk losing you, not with what you've discovered." Richardson's tone softened. "Get some rest." "That's twice you've ignored me today. First in the air, now in my office. Dismissed." Rook walked back to his quarters in the dark, frustrated but too exhausted to argue further. His roommate, Captain David Chen, was reading by lamplight when Rook entered. "Heard you had quite a day," Chen said, not looking up from his book. Chen flew bombers with the 91st Bomb Group and had survived 18 missions over Germany. They'd become friends despite flying different aircraft. "Yeah," Rook collapsed onto his bunk. "Discovered something new. Maybe important, maybe stupid. Command's trying to figure out which." Important and stupid aren't mutually exclusive, Chen observed. Most breakthrough ideas are both. That's what makes them breakthroughs. Philosophical tonight. I'm flying to Berlin tomorrow. Makes a man thoughtful. Chen finally looked up. You got mail, by the way. On your desk. Rook sat up quickly. A letter waited, the handwriting familiar. His heart raced as he tore it open. Danny's handwriting filled the page. His brother was alive, recovering from shrapnel wounds in a field hospital near Anzio. The relief was overwhelming. Rook read the letter 3 times, memorizing every word. Good news, Chen asked gently. My brother's alive. Injured but alive. That's something worth celebrating. Come on, the officers' club is probably still serving. You look like you could use a drink. The club was crowded with pilots and crew, all trying to forget the missions they'd flown or would fly tomorrow. Rook nursed a whiskey, while Webb and Jensen recounted the day's fight to anyone who'd listen. Their story grew more dramatic with each retelling, but the core truth remained. Something unusual had happened, something that might change how they fought. A week passed. Engineering teams examined Rook's Mustang, measuring stress fractures, analyzing metal fatigue. Test pilots flew experimental dives under controlled conditions. Fighter Command brought in aerodynamics experts from both military and civilian backgrounds. The consensus emerged slowly. What Rook had done was theoretically possible, but incredibly dangerous. The margin between success and catastrophic failure was razor thin. But it worked. Colonel Mitchell Davis arrived from Fighter Command headquarters to observe the tests personally. He was a veteran of the First World War, had flown SPADs over France in 1918, and carried himself with the authority of someone who'd seen aviation evolve from fabric and wire to metal and power. Captain Sullivan, Davis said, reviewing the test flight data, you've stumbled onto something tactical. The Germans have dominated energy fighting because their 109s and 190s are excellent at boom and zoom attacks. But this maneuver, this vertical dive and zoom climb, gives our Mustangs a counter. Maybe even an advantage. With respect, sir, Rook replied, it's not easy to execute. The timing has to be perfect. Too early on the pull-out, you'll still be in range. Too late, and you'll overstress the aircraft or hit the ground. Which is why we need to develop doctrine around it, Davis said. Train pilots specifically in this technique. Make it repeatable, teachable. He paused. I'm authorizing a special training program. You'll lead it, Sullivan. Select 5 pilots, the best in the squadron. You'll teach them what you discovered. Refine the maneuver, develop tactics. Sir, I'm a combat pilot, not an instructor. You're both now. This could save hundreds of lives, protect dozens of bomber missions. That's worth more than one more pilot in the air. Davis's expression hardened. That's not a request, Captain. The training program began the next week. Rook selected Webb, Jensen, Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, one of the few female pilots flying combat missions, Lieutenant James Park, and Captain Henry Walsh. They were experienced, skilled, and most importantly, had the instinct for unconventional thinking. The first training flight nearly killed Jensen. He entered the dive too aggressively, exceeded even Rook's speeds, and barely pulled out in time. The Mustang's wings showed permanent deformation afterward. Morrison fared better, demonstrating exceptional control throughout the maneuver. She had a dancer's precision, translating body awareness into aircraft control. It's not about brute force, Morrison explained during the debrief. It's about feeling the aircraft, knowing exactly how much stress it can take and riding that edge without crossing it. Week after week, they practiced. The maneuver gained a name among the pilots. Rook's dive, though Rook himself preferred the more technical vertical boom extension. They developed variations, shallow entry angles for less speed but safer execution, steep angles for maximum energy advantage, and what they called the double stoop, where the pilot performed 2 consecutive dives in rapid succession. The engineering teams modified several Mustangs specifically for the maneuver, reinforcing wing spars and improving control surface responsiveness. The changes added 50 pounds, but increased safety margins by nearly 20%. By early March, the 6 pilots had mastered the technique. Fighter Command approved its use in combat operations. With strict protocols, only execute when absolutely necessary, only with altitude advantage, always with wingman coverage. The opportunity came on March 18th during a massive raid on Berlin. Over 800 bombers escorted by 600 fighters headed toward the German capital. The Luftwaffe threw everything they had at the formation, over 300 fighters in one of the largest aerial battles of the war. Rook's squadron was assigned to the lead bomber group. As they approached Berlin, radar stations on the ground vectored German fighters toward the formation. The sky filled with aircraft, B-17s, B-24s, P-51s, P-47s, and German 109s, 190s, even a few Heinkel 162 jets in their combat debut. The jets worried everyone. Fast, deadly. They could tear through bomber formations before the escorts could react. Rook watched one streak past, its turbine roaring, thinking how obsolete their tactics might become if jet fighters proliferated. Blue flight? "We have bandits, 9 o'clock level, closing fast," Webb called. "Count 20 plus." The German formation came in tight, disciplined. They'd learned painful lessons about American fighters and adapted their tactics. Instead of individual attacks, they struck in coordinated waves, overwhelming local defensive positions. Rook led Blue flight to intercept, but the Germans had altitude advantage. They dove through the bombers before the Mustangs could engage, then climbed away. 2 B-17s fell from formation, one with its wing sheared off, another spinning with dead engines. "They're going to repeat the attack," Morrison said over the radio. "Same pattern, different angle." She was right. The Germans climbed to 28,000 feet, reforming for another pass. Rook checked his position. Blue flight was at 24,000 feet, with fuel for maybe 40 more minutes of combat before they'd have to turn for home. "Blue flight, this is Rook. Prepare maneuver Delta." That was their code for Rook's dive. "We're going to let them commit to their attack run. Then we counter," his pilots acknowledged, spreading out to give themselves maneuvering room. Below, the bomber stream held formation, gunners tracking the German fighters with their 50 caliber turrets. The B-17s and B-24s were tough, could absorb tremendous damage, but concentrated fighter attacks still killed them. The Germans began their dive, 23 fighters angling down toward the bombers. They'd chosen their angle carefully, coming from the sun, making themselves harder to spot, harder to engage. "Hold," Rook said, watching the Germans commit to their attack angle. "Hold!" The German lead opened fire at 600 yards, cannons flashing. His wingmen followed suit, converging on a single bomber box. "Now, execute." Rook pushed his nose down, entering a 70-degree dive. His airspeed climbed rapidly, 400 miles per hour, 450, 480. The Mustang vibrated but held together, the engine roaring at maximum power. Behind him, 5 other P-51s followed in staggered formation. The Germans were focused on the bombers, hadn't seen the American fighters above them. By the time they realized, it was too late. Rook's flight slashed through the German formation at incredible speed. 6 Mustangs moving like bullets. Rook selected his target, a 109 lining up on a damaged B-17. He fired from 400 yards, a long burst that walked through the Germans' fuselage. The 109 staggered, rolled, and dove away trailing smoke. Rook didn't pursue. There were more targets. Morrison got 2 in rapid succession, her accuracy devastating. Webb and Jensen each damaged one, forcing the Germans to break off their attacks. Park's guns jammed after his first kill, but his presence disrupted 2 more Germans. Walsh fought a prolonged engagement with a Focke-Wulf 190, the 2 aircraft spiraling downward in a deadly duel. The entire engagement lasted 4 minutes. When the German formation broke off, 8 of their fighters were destroyed or damaged, and the bomber stream had only lost 1 more B-17. The mathematics of the exchange heavily favored the Americans. As Blue flight climbed back to escort altitude, Rook's radio crackled with transmissions from other squadrons. They'd seen the maneuver, understood its effectiveness. Word was spreading through the fighter groups in real time. "All Mustang flights, this is Shepard Lead," the bomber commander transmitted. "Outstanding work, Blue flight. You just saved a lot of lives up here." The flight home was somber despite the victory. War was never clean, never simple. Men on both sides had died today. Some had parachuted to captivity or death. Others had gone down with their aircraft, cremated in burning fuel or frozen in the thin air. But the bomber stream made it back. Most of the B-17s that limped home on shot-up engines would fly again. The crews would survive to fly more missions, drop more bombs, bring the war closer to its end. That evening, Fighter Command issued new tactical guidelines incorporating Rook's dive into standard doctrine for all P-51 squadrons. Training programs would begin immediately across multiple bases. The maneuver that had started as one desperate pilot's refusal to die was becoming part of American fighter tactics. Rook found himself called to a meeting with senior commanders, colonels, generals, even a representative from Washington. They wanted details, wanted to understand how one technique could shift tactical balance. Captain Sullivan, Brigadier General Thompson, said, "Your maneuver has changed how we fight. Initial reports suggest German fighter effectiveness has dropped by 15% when our squadrons employ this technique." "That's significant." "Sir, it's not without risks," Rook reminded them. "We've had 2 aircraft suffer structural damage during training. If pilots execute improperly, all combat flying involves risk," Thompson interrupted. "But risk managed intelligently saves lives overall. Your technique gives our pilots options they didn't have before. Options mean survival." The meeting lasted 2 hours. They discussed training protocols, aircraft modifications, tactical scenarios. By the end, Rook felt drained, overwhelmed by how a single moment of desperation had cascaded into something much larger. Outside, Chen found him sitting on the steps of the operations building, staring at the darkening sky. "Heard you're famous now," Chen said. Sitting down beside him, "I'm not comfortable with that. Nobody comfortable with fame earned it by trying to be famous. You were trying not to die." "That's different." Chen lit a cigarette, offered one to Rook, who declined. "You know what the bomber crews are saying? They're saying you're the reason their odds improved. Every mission they've got better chances of coming home. Some still don't make it. No, but more do. That matters." Chen blew smoke into the evening air. "I fly tomorrow again, Munich. We're expecting heavy resistance. Knowing you fighter boys have this new trick makes me feel better about our chances." Rook looked at his friend. "Be careful up there. Always am. But careful only goes so far." Chen stood, crushing out his cigarette. "See you when I get back." But Chen didn't come back. His bomber was shot down over Munich by flak. 6 of the 10 crew survived to become prisoners of war. Chen wasn't among them. The news hit Rook hard. David Chen had been his closest friend on base, the person who understood the weight of command, the responsibility of making decisions that affected lives. His death was a reminder that no technique, no maneuver, no training could eliminate the fundamental horror of war. The missions continued. Spring brought better weather, more raids, more opportunities to use the new tactics. German pilots learned to watch for the vertical dives, tried to counter them, but the speed advantage was too great. The Mustangs could engage or disengage at will, controlling the tempo of fights. By April, reports from across the European theater showed measurable impact. Bomber loss rates had decreased. Fighter-kill ratios had improved. German fighter pilots, interviewed after the war, would mention their fear of American fighters employing the dive attack, describing it as nearly impossible to counter. But Rook flew each mission with Chen's death in mind. Victory meant nothing if it became abstract, if they forgot the human cost. Every pilot who didn't return, every bomber crew lost, every German fighter destroyed, all represented lives ended, families broken, futures erased. On April 25th, Rook's squadron flew their last mission escorting bombers to Pilsen. The war in Europe was winding down. German resistance was collapsing, though pockets of fierce fighting remained. As they crossed into German airspace, Rook thought about everything that had led to this moment. The desperate dive 7 months ago, the training, the lives saved, the friends lost. The mission was quiet. Few German fighters rose to meet them. The Luftwaffe was largely destroyed, fuel reserves depleted, experienced pilots killed or captured. The bomber stream hit its targets and returned without significant losses. A week later, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The celebration at Debden was subdued. Too many empty chairs, too many friends who'd never see victory. Rook stood outside the officers' club, listening to the sounds of relief and grief mixing together, thinking about everything they'd endured. Major Richardson approached, 2 glasses of whiskey in hand. He offered one to Rook. To the ones who didn't make it home, Richardson said quietly. They drank in silence. After a moment, Richardson spoke again. "Fighter Command wants you to come back to the States, train new pilots. Share what you learned here. The war's not over, sir. There's still Japan. True, but your contribution here is done. You changed how we fight, Rook. That's worth more than any individual combat record. Richardson paused. Your brother's being shipped home too. Medical discharge. He'll need family around during recovery. Danny. Rook had received letters regularly now, watching his brother's progress through rehabilitation. The wound had cost him partial use of his left hand, but he'd survived. That was what mattered. When do I leave? Rook asked. 2 weeks. Enough time to close things out here, say goodbyes. Those 2 weeks passed quickly. Rook flew one last time, a solo flight over the English countryside, saying goodbye to the aircraft that had carried him through so much. He touched down at Debden one final time, taxied to the flight line and shut down the engine. Pete Morrison was waiting. End of an era, sir. End of a lot of things, Rook replied, climbing down. He ran his hand along the Mustang's fuselage one last time. Take care of her. Always do, Captain. Always do. The flight back to America felt surreal. Rook sat in the cargo aircraft surrounded by other returning servicemen, each processing victory and survival in their own ways. Some slept, others talked. A few stared silently out the windows. When they landed in New York, the city erupted in celebration. Ticker tape parades, crowds cheering, women kissing soldiers. Rook moved through it all in a daze, overwhelmed by the contrast between this jubilation and the battlefields he'd left behind. He found Danny at a veterans hospital in Pennsylvania. His brother had aged years in months, thinner, harder, with eyes that had seen too much. But when Danny saw Rook, his face lit up with genuine joy. You made it, Danny said, embracing his brother with his good arm. So did you. They spent hours catching up, sharing stories they'd never written in letters, processing experiences that civilians couldn't understand. Danny talked about the mud of Italy, the terror of artillery watching friends die inches away. Rook described the sky battles, the constant fear before every mission, the weight of responsibility for other pilots' lives. You saved a lot of people, Danny said eventually. I read about it. Your dive technique. It made the papers, even in the military news. I was trying to save myself, Rook admitted. Everything else came after. Isn't that how most heroism works? Someone refuses to give up, finds a way through impossible situations, and that becomes something bigger. Danny smiled. You're teaching now? Starting next month. New fighter pilots at Eglin Field. Teaching them not just the maneuver, but why it works, when to use it, when not to. When not to. Rook nodded. That's the most important lesson. The technique works, but it's dangerous. Pilots need judgment, need to understand risk versus reward. Push too hard at the wrong time and they'll kill themselves. Not hard enough and they'll die anyway. Finding that balance, that's what I'll teach. Over the following months, Rook established training programs that would influence American fighter tactics for years. He emphasized not just technical skill, but judgment, situational awareness, and the responsibility of leading others in combat. His students would go on to fly in Korea, some even in Vietnam, carrying forward the lessons learned in desperate moments over German skies. Years later, aviation historians would study the tactical innovations of World War II. Rook's dive would be analyzed in military academies, discussed in academic papers, simulated in computer models. Some would call it revolutionary. Others would argue it was simply good piloting pushed to extremes. The debate would continue for decades, but for Rook, sitting in his small office at Eglin Field, watching young pilots practice the maneuver that bore his name, the technical details mattered less than the fundamental truth he'd learned. Sometimes survival requires going beyond what's considered safe, pushing past established limits, and trusting in your skill and your aircraft. Sometimes refusing to accept the expected outcome makes the difference between death and life, between defeat and victory. He never forgot the friends who didn't make it back. Their names stayed with him, Chen and dozens of others who died in burning aircraft or exploding bombers. Every successful student, every pilot who mastered the technique and survived combat because of it, was a small vindication of their sacrifice. The maneuver itself evolved over time. Jet aircraft brought new possibilities and new limits. The fundamental principle remained, using energy management and aircraft capabilities in ways that surprised opponents and created tactical advantages. But the specifics changed with technology, doctrine, and opponents. Rook retired from active service in 1952, having trained over 300 fighter pilots. Many achieved ace status. Several became test pilots, pushing aviation further into the jet age. A few became astronauts, taking the lessons of energy management and precision control into space itself. He settled in California, married a woman named Grace, who understood silence and patience, raised 2 daughters who never quite grasped what their father had experienced. How could they? The war had forged something in him that peacetime could never fully reach, but sometimes on clear days, he'd drive to an airfield and watch jets practice dogfighting maneuvers. The aircraft were different, sleeker, faster, more deadly. But the fundamental challenges remained the same: physics, limits, fear, and the human will to overcome all three. One day in 1974, a young Air Force lieutenant approached him at an air show. The lieutenant wore a flight suit and carried himself with the confidence of combat experience. "Vietnam," Rook guessed. "Captain Sullivan?" The lieutenant asked. "I'm Lieutenant Marcus Webb, Jr. My father flew with you in the 334th. Rook's heart skipped. Marcus Webb, he was my wingman. Good pilot, better friend. "He passed away last year," Webb Jr. said. "Cancer. But before he died, he told me if I ever met you, I should say thanks. Said you taught him how to stay alive in situations where he should have died." That lesson kept him breathing through 30 missions. Rook felt emotions rising that he'd kept buried for decades. "Your father saved my life more than once. We kept each other alive." He told me about Rook's dive. They taught it at the academy, modified version for jets, but same principle. "My instructors said you changed fighter tactics." Webb paused. "I used it over Hanoi last year. Had 2 MiGs on my tail, couldn't shake them. Remembered the technique, executed it, came back around behind them. Got one, drove the other off. You executed properly? Didn't overstress the airframe?" Webb smiled. "Yes, sir. Just like the manual teaches now." "Though my crew chief said I came closer to limits than he'd prefer." "That's the technique working as designed," Rook replied. "Close to limits, but not over them." They talked for an hour, Rook answering questions about the war, the squadron, the development of the maneuver. When Webb finally left, Rook felt a strange sense of completion. The chain continued, knowledge passed down, techniques refined, pilots teaching pilots how to survive and win. That evening, sitting on his porch watching the sun set over the Pacific, Rook thought about the impossible arc of his life. From desperate pilot exceeding aircraft limits to survive, to trainer shaping fighter doctrine, to retired veteran watching new generations apply those lessons. All of it spiraling out from one moment in 1944 when he'd refused to die, when he'd pushed past fear and limits and discovered something new. He'd never wanted to be famous, never sought recognition or awards. He'd just wanted to survive, to help his squadron survive, to maybe make a small difference in a vast and terrible war. But small differences compound. One technique became squadron doctrine, became fighter tactics, became military strategy. One pilot's refusal to accept death influenced thousands of others, who influenced thousands more. The ripples spread across decades, across wars, across technological revolutions. Grace came out with tea, sat beside him in comfortable silence. She knew his moods, knew when he was visiting memories she couldn't share. "Thinking about the war?" she asked gently. "Always," Rook admitted. "But also about what came after, about Marcus Webb's son using what we developed. About continuity. You saved a lot of lives, I also took them. German pilots had families, had people who loved them. Everyone I shot down was someone's son, maybe someone's father or brother. War doesn't have clean answers," Grace said. "Something she'd learned through decades with him." "No, it doesn't." Rook sipped his tea, watching the sky fade from gold to orange to purple. "But we do what we can, when we can. Make the choices available to us. Try to tilt things towards something better." That was the real lesson he'd realized over the years. Not the technical details of dive angles and speed management, but the deeper principle. When faced with impossible situations, when every option seems to lead to failure, sometimes the answer is doing something unprecedented, something others said was impossible or forbidden. Not recklessly, but with skill and judgment and willingness to accept risk in service of something larger than yourself. Years later, when historians interviewed Rook for oral history projects, they always asked about that first dive. That moment when he exceeded aircraft limits and discovered the technique. Were you scared? They'd ask. Terrified, he'd answer honestly, but more scared of giving up, of accepting that I'd die because the manual said the aircraft couldn't handle more stress. Fear of death can be overcome by refusing to accept it as inevitable. Did you think about the broader implications, about changing fighter tactics? Not even slightly. I thought about staying alive for the next 10 seconds. Everything else came later. What do you want people to understand about what you did? That question always made him pause. Finally, he'd answer, that limits are often psychological as much as physical. Engineers set conservative boundaries because they can't predict every situation. Pilots in combat face situations engineers never imagined. Sometimes surviving means going beyond guidelines, but only when you understand those guidelines thoroughly enough to know where the real limits are. Knowledge, skill, and judgment. Without all three, you're just being reckless. Rook died in 1996 at 75, his body finally giving out after decades of hard use. His funeral brought together an unlikely group: elderly veterans who'd flown with him in 1944, middle-aged pilots he'd trained in the 1940s and 50s, younger pilots who'd learned from his techniques, adapted for modern aircraft, and aviation historians who'd studied his contributions. They told stories, shared memories, and tried to articulate what his life had meant. The consensus that emerged was simple. He'd been a pilot who refused to accept defeat, who'd pushed beyond established limits at a critical moment, and whose willingness to question conventional wisdom had saved countless lives. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from his daughter, reading a letter she'd found among his papers. It was written to the parents of a pilot Rook had trained who'd been killed in Korea. In it, Rook wrote, "Your son mastered the techniques we taught him. He executed with precision and skill. But war is never fair, never certain. Good pilots die alongside bad ones. Skill improves odds but guarantees nothing. What I can tell you is that your son's training gave him every advantage we could provide. He knew his aircraft, understood tactics, and flew with the judgment of pilots twice his age. That he died anyway doesn't diminish his skill or preparation. It reflects the fundamental brutality of combat aviation. I'm sorry we couldn't give him more. That honesty, that refusal to offer easy comfort or hide behind patriotic platitudes, captured something essential about Rook. He'd seen too much death to romanticize it, too much war to glorify it. He'd done his duty, developed techniques that saved lives and trained others to survive. But he never pretended it was anything other than what it was. Humans trying to kill other humans with increasing efficiency. With survival coming down to skill, luck, and the willingness to do what others thought impossible. The maneuver he'd discovered lived on, adapted and evolved, taught to new generations of fighter pilots. Rook's dive became a footnote in aviation history, mentioned in textbooks and tactical manuals, studied by those who wanted to understand how innovation happens in combat. But the real legacy wasn't the technique itself. It was the lesson behind it, that sometimes survival and victory require going beyond established boundaries, that rules exist to guide but shouldn't constrain when circumstances demand more, and that the difference between life and death often comes down to one person's refusal to accept the expected outcome. That lesson echoed across decades, across wars, across technological revolutions. From propeller aircraft to jets to missiles to drones, the fundamental truth remained: human judgment, skill, and willingness to take calculated risks made the difference between winning and losing, living and dying, and it all started with one pilot in one desperate moment, pushing his aircraft beyond what the manual said was possible, discovering that sometimes the forbidden path is the only path to survival, and that breaking rules with skill and judgment can save not just your own life, but dozens of others who depend on you to find a way through the impossible.